Let's do this. All right. As I told you guys, the first things first, we got to understand is what is conscious edits. Okay. What do these Muslims mean by conscious edits? Every time we tell them that tell us has why does the Quran contradict the stories in our Bible, in the Torah and in the Injil? Why does it do this? And they keep on saying it's not contradicting. This is the author of the Quran who is on purpose consciously editing the previous scriptures because they're corrupted. Okay? So, therefore, they've come up with this new theory of conscious edits, right, in 2025. Now, let's learn what this conscious edits, what they mean by that. Number one, they tell us that Allah gives the Torah and the Injil. Let me make sure that I have this nice and big for you guys, actually. Allah makes sure that they have the Torah and the Injil. There we go. Gives it to the Jews and gives it to Isa. Gives it to Moses and gives it to Isa. And gives it to everybody, right? That's step one. Then they say that soon after that, it gets corrupted. After they gave the Torah, soon after that, it gets corrupted. Okay? And they say this also happens with the gospel. That also gets changed. And then they say, in comes their God and gives revelations to Muhammad in the 7th century, revealing the original content. So that's on a high level. Step 1, step 2, step 3. Step 1, first thing they say, Allah gave the Torah and the gospel to the prophets. Then they say, during the time of the Jews, as soon as he gives it, it starts getting corrupted. Then they say that Jesus comes. Jesus gets taught the original Torah and the Injil, and then again it gets corrupted. And then Muhammad comes and reveals the original content. So it's revealing the original content, it's retelling the original stories, what the original was supposed to be. That's what their steps are. 1, 2, 3, right there, okay? So now, all right, again, step 1, here's the thing broken down a little bit better for you. Allah gave the true revelations to Moses and Jesus. That revelation agreed fully with the Quran. Step 2, at some point, the Jews and Christians corrupted those scriptures. Their stories, the theology, the doctrines, the prophecies were altered. And step 3, the Quran comes later and retells the original story correctly. So when the Quran contradicts the Bible, it's really not contradicting revelation, it's correcting the corruption. That's their entire move to explain why you have differences between a story in the Quran, the same story in the Quran, versus the other one. Okay? Good Lord, dude, I don't even understand this. Now it's telling me it's still the image or my camera. I've got something on camera, bro. I'm moving things on camera. I don't even understand. What do you want me to do? Okay. Just these restrictions, this glitch on TikTok is just crazy. Okay. So now, that entire move, they use this to escape the Islamic dilemma. And the they use it to escape because they say the Quran confirms the Torah and the Gospel. But that dilemma tells you it contradicts the Torah and Gospel. Therefore, the Bible must be corrupted. Therefore, the Quran is restoring the original. On the face of it, it seems like a massive cope, because it is. Now, the first thing we want to do to sit down and talk about refuting this stuff here is we want to point out the circularity issue with this problem. What does circularity mean? What does circularity mean? That means what they're saying is the first thing we should point out is this is entirely a circular perspective. Why? Because the Muslim assumes the Quran's author is infallible, can never make any mistake. Therefore, the Quran cannot contradict true revelation. They said that's not a contradiction, it's correcting it. Therefore, if you find that it contradicts the Bible must be corrupted. Therefore, the Quran must be restoring the original. Those 4 things is their argument, which is not an argument, it's a presupposition loop. Okay? It's a presupposition loop. The fatal part of why we call it circular, is because it's saying whatever the Quran agrees with the Quran. In other words, if the Quran agrees with the Bible, they will see, the Quran is confirming the Bible. And if the Quran contradicts the Bible, they'll say, see, it's correcting the Bible. That means there is no possible outcome that falsifies this theory. What does it mean to falsify a theory? Okay? What does it mean to falsify a theory? To falsify a theory means that if every single verse, essentially, since every single verse in the Quran can be explained away this way, that there's no actual way of knowing, since every single outcome has an answer, that is textbook unfalsifiability. It cannot be unfalsifiable. Okay? Now, what does it mean to be falsifiable? Every kind of a theory you have has to have a way, or at least an chance at falsifying it. But if you say everything that the Quran says is true and whatever disagrees with the Quran is false, now you've created, a scenario where every time an evidence that could count against the Quran, showing that the Quran got something wrong, you would say that is actually a corruption. So what would ever count as evidence that the Quran got something wrong, or that this conscious added story is false? If the answer is nothing, you are not doing reasoning, you're doing immunization. So their theory, they've covered themselves with this conscious edit in one stroke and made a scenario. Under no circumstances could you ever prove the Quran to be wrong. And that theory fails if a theory is not falsifiable. If a theory that explains everything, see how it says here? The theory that explains everything, conscious added, is never vulnerable, cannot be disproven, adjusts itself to any evidence, i.e. anytime we show you an evidence and look, the Quran is actually contradicting this, it's got a story different than what the original one is, and every time the answer is that's because it's corrupt, that's because it's corrupt, that's because it's corrupt. Just a blanket answer that way. That is not a historical argument. You are theologically insulating yourself. Okay? So if your explanation works, whether the Quran agrees or contradicts, then it's not an explanation. It's what we call a built-in escape hatch. Okay? We have scholars like Karl Popper and Anthony Flew who talks about what falsifiability it means, and why, if your theory does not allow, if it's completely unfalsifiable, then that's really not Alexa, stop. That is really not a story. That is really not a hypothesis that is a working hypothesis that can be accepted by any scholarship. Alexa, stop. Okay, so I got that thing going off on there. So now what, initially, just coming back to it, okay, we're learning how to defeat this conscious edit. Okay, so what have we learned? The Muslims argue, step one, they say Allah gave true revelations to Moses and Jesus. That revelation agreed with the Quran. At some point, with the Jews and with the Christians, they corrupted those scriptures. The stories, theology, doctrines, prophecies were altered. Then, in comes Muhammad and revelation in the 7th century that comes later and retells what the original story was, what it's supposed to be. Okay? What the original story was and what it's supposed to be. So the Quran comes later and retells the original story. So when the Quran contradicts the Bible, it's not contradicting revelations, it's just correcting corruption. And that's their escape to the Islamic dilemma. As to why does it contradict, okay? The Quran confirms the Torah and Gospel, but contradicts the Torah and Gospel. Therefore, they say the Bible must be corrupted. Therefore, the Quran is restoring the original stories. Now, the first things you do to sit down and ask the Muslim this question is this specific thing, circularity. This poses a circular problem because it assumes that the Quran author is infallible. It assumes that the Quran cannot contradict true revelation. It assumes that if it does contradict the Bible, it must be the Bible is corrupted in every instance, and therefore it assumes that the Quran is restoring the original, must be restoring the original. So again, that can be an argument. It has, again, a fatal feature, which is it is not falsifiable. I.e., if the Quran agrees with the Bible, they'll say, see, it confirms it. And if the Quran contradicts with the Bible, you'd say, see, it's correcting it. Then they also go one step further and they tell you all the parts that they have corrected, they say, see, now that it agrees with the Quran. So that's where the Quran is true. So in this huge problem that they have, there is no possible, with this circular argument, there is no possible outcome that falsifies the theory. Right? Since every single verse in the Quran, as Chris at Speaker's Corner had said, quoting him, since every single verse in the Quran can be explained this way, there's no actual way of knowing, what is true. Since every single outcome has this one answer, the Quran is right, the Quran is right, the Quran is right. That is textbook unfalsibility. Why is it devastating to their argument? Because we say, so what would ever count, if you ask a Muslim, so what would ever count as evidence that the Quran got something wrong? Can the Quran get anything wrong? Or is that the conscious edit story is false? Because if it can never get anything wrong, there's no possible way to get it wrong. If the answer is nothing, then the Muslims are not doing reasoning, they're just creating immunization. So, a theory that explains everything, pay attention, that is never vulnerable, that cannot be disproven, and that adjusts itself to any evidence you provide against it, is not a historical argument. It is thrown aside by all scholarship. Okay? If your explanation works, whether the Quran agrees or contradicts, then it's not an explanation, it's a built-in escape hatch. Now, some of the questions that you can ask the Muslims at this point when they make this conscious edit claim is, we do a falsibility check. You ask them, what evidence would prove your conscious edit theory false? That's how you ask them that stuff, okay? What evidence would it ever prove it false? If, ask them, is this like, heads you win, tails you win? If the Quran agrees with the Bible, you call it confirmation. If it contradicts you, you call it correction. So when do you ever admit an error? Is there ever an error? Nope. Our Quran doesn't have any error. Okay. So then you are not showing me that the Torah and the Gospels were corrupted here. You're assuming they were whenever the Quran clashes with them. You're not actually showing me anything. And the last question you could ask them is this how you test any claim in real life? By making a rule that every outcome supports your claim. That's not how you must do it. So what they're trying to tell us is that the author must be God. They're trying to tell us the author is God, but we'll tell you that the author of the Quran is not God. They're trying to say the conscious edits, because conscious edits requires the author can never err, he can never make a mistake. The author knows all the ancient lost revelations perfectly, and the author restores it flawlessly. So the conclusion is the author must be God. Okay? In other words, to advocate for conscious edits is to advocate that the author, before we even evaluate anything, is God. You cannot challenge that position. You cannot say like, hey, we need evidence for this stuff. It's the same kind of idea if someone asked me, how do I know the Bible is true? And imagine if I responded by saying, all scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching. That means everything that is in there, it's come from God-breathed, so it's got to be true. Likewise with the conscious edits, you already have to be a Muslim to believe this. And in our case, you have to be a Christian to believe this. That's called circular reasoning. So you're not proving the Quran is divine, you've assumed it. That's not neutral reasoning, that's internal apologetics. Now, why does the scholarship not doesn't use this? Why serious scholarship does not use this theory? Okay, this is why the serious scholarship, because of this circularity and not being falsifiable, would never take a conscious edits as a serious theory to explain what the author of the Quran is doing. Why? Because in academic methodologies, you don't assume the author is omniscient. You don't assume infallibility. You don't assume divine authorship. You test those claims against evidence. So all of this stuff, they test it. Is it true? Just because somebody came and said something and wrote a book, does it automatically become, yes, it's God, yes, it's true, yes, it's no. You got to test it. That's why conscious edit is not a historical model. It's just a theological shield. Okay? So now, when Muslims use conscious edits, it's worth understanding some of the psychology behind what's happening in here. The Muslim is using this because it's basically, and it's a great example I heard from Chris. He says, you know, when a turtle hides in its shell, it's like that. It's a self-defense technique. It functions as an immediate way to relieve the tension. Okay? Like a mental safe mode. What they think of when they think of conscious edits is a universal answer to every contradiction. Conscious edits has to be applied as a band-aid to all of these. It can't be just a band-aid to some, because then there will still be other contradictions that will be left out there with no answers. So it becomes a very quick, simple answer for Muslims to give to basically shut down the conversation and to make the Muslims feel psychological relief, because they don't really need to say much more. It's just corrupt. So that's the basis of why they do conscious edits. Now, how do we prove this wrong? It's a pretty easy way to prove it wrong. It's a pretty easy way to prove it wrong. Okay? And that's when we're going to take one of the, I know a lot of people are requesting up, but I'm going to go through a story here and then you guys can come up. We're going to prove it wrong and then you guys can come up here and talk about this. Okay? So just bear in here, watch what happens here. How do we prove that this entire, we've already said this conscious edit is circular, it's not falsifiable, no scholarship takes it seriously. You cannot come up with an ad hoc theory in 2025 and just put a blanket statement and say, well, everything that Quran says is true, anything it disagrees with is false, and then whatever disagrees with it, the Quran sits down and corrects, and after you correct it, you say, see, that now is aligned with the Quran. That thing that we just corrected is aligned with the Quran. So, see, Christians, you must be Muslims. That's what they've come up with so far. So how do we prove it wrong? Okay, so we're going to set a really easy way. Okay, the very fact that they're sitting down and telling us that every contradiction in the Quran is because of corruption, it makes it easy for us to prove that this theory is absolute rubbish. Okay? That actually makes it very easy for us as people who are not Muslims to tear the band-aid right off and to expose the significant problem that is lying in the wound itself, in what they got. It's actually very easy for us to do, and we're going to do it now. Okay? All we need to do is show that a conscious edit does not account for every contradiction. There are many contradictions that it doesn't account for. And because of this, the problem still remains for them to answer. The Islamic dilemma still remains. Remember, understand this again. I want you to understand what I'm saying here. If the Muslims are saying that the conscious edit is the Quran readjusting the stories back to the original form, and it's undoing the corruption, that means every difference between a Quran story and the original story that we have in our Bible is that if the Quran is contradicting it, it is correcting it. That means every contradiction it's doing it on. And all we have to do to prove that theory wrong is find one. There are many, but we just have to find one that it doesn't work for. And that will destroy it. Okay? and that will destroy it. Okay, now we're going to go into this. Again, guys, this is going to be a great session for you to learn and how to defeat the conscious edit and confirmation, general confirmation. A great session. I'm going to go into the Quran. I'm going to go into the Torah, and we're going to do on a specific story in the Torah. Okay. Again, we don't have to refute 100 contradictions. You just need one contradiction that their universal fix, i.e., conscious edits, can plausibly explain. Okay. So for that, we're going to look at Surah 12. We're going to look at, Sasha, I'm doing a teaching session. What do you got? Brother, I got it. I'm doing this. I don't want to be disturbed on this, Sasha. Sorry. I'm doing it. I've got everything written down. Okay? So just let me go and do it. People are recording this session. Okay. So we're going to look at Surah 12. And we're going to look at a particular narrative around Joseph and I'm going to give you a small part of the narrative first, and then I'm going to go much more deeper and show you many other differences. But I may do the second part later. But I'm just going to start with a small little thing here. And then we're going to see that same story in Genesis 37, 18 to 20. Okay? And then we're also going to talk about something really weird with this whole corruption thing, where we'll talk about in Quran chapter 5 verse 46. But anyways, what we have here is there is a story in the Torah that is talking about Joseph's brothers plotting to unalive him or get rid of him. Okay? And this is one of the most effective cases, one of the most effective stories that I have for you guys to learn. And a specific part of the story. There's lots of differences between the Quran story in that entire episode. Lots of differences between that and what's in Genesis, okay? In the Torah. But we're just going to start off with a simple thing. The one that I find most effective to show this is because there's very little wiggle room for them to get out of this story of Joseph. That's why I'm choosing this one here. Okay. Again, I've seen other folks ask Dean Response and Jake the Metaphysician about this specific story, and they panicked. They had no answers. They came up with some rubbish like, oh, that's because they're hypocrites. Well, what the hell? Just throwing a word hypocrite? That doesn't answer anything. Okay. So now, here it is. It's in Surah 12. It's basically the story of Joseph. But it's not the same story of Joseph as we know in Genesis 37. But rather, it's a modified form. Okay? In Surah 12, especially 12, 9 to 10, and then in Genesis 37, where the plot begins when they see Joseph from afar off. In Genesis 37, 18 to 25, it says, but they saw him in the distance, and before they reached them, they plotted to kill him. In the Genesis story, it says, the brothers saw him in the distance. Before he reached them, they plotted to kill them. It said, here comes the dreamer, they said to each other, come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we shall see what comes of his dreams. Now, the contradiction here with the Quran is, when did they plot to do this? Okay? Let's look at the Quran's account when it talks about Joseph's brothers planning to kidnap him and throw him down a hole. In the Quranic account, they plan this at home. But in the Genesis account, they plan to do this as they're walking towards Joseph and they see him in a distance. The Genesis explicitly says that they saw him from afar and then they conspired in Genesis 37, 18 to 20. In the Quranic Surah 12, it has the brothers plotting the dialogue and the throw him into the well plan in chapter 12, verses 9 to 10, and then later request to take him and that is chapter 12, 11 to 12, which is they planned it at home. That tells you that they planned this at home, not when they see it. They're having a discussion among themselves somewhere else, and then much later they request to take him. So the key argument isn't that they just differ. It's the type of difference. It's a change in the actual story, in the actual narrative. It is something that cannot be explained by a scribal error. It's clearly an intentional change that has occurred. Your teaching point here, guys, is Conscious Edits claims that the Bible got corrupted and the Quran restores it. So now we are flipping this kind of structured narrative alteration that doesn't look like it is, in this case, it doesn't look like it is an accidental copying error. It looks like it's retelling a story. Now, what is the motive? This is what we want to ask Muslims, and then we'll bring them up. Why would the Jews change this? Okay? At this point, I want you to ask Muslims to explain the motive the Jews would have to corrupt this particular aspect of the story. Okay, if you think Conscious Edits is the Quran correcting prior corrupted scriptures, this does not align with the Quran in this particular instance. This is just a deferring account. You're saying the Jews received a revelation, but they intentionally corrupted it by changing this very specific part of the story. What is the part of the story we talked about? Is that when they decided to unalive Joseph or throw him in the well, that, get rid of him in other words, is very different in Genesis versus the Quran. So our question to the Muslims is, what are the possible motives that the Jews could have had to do this change, to corrupt it and make that change? The specific thing, you can't just say just because. Is there a political motive? It doesn't seem so. Are there any ethical or moral motives? Again, it doesn't seem so. Are there any prophetic? Is there a prophecy behind these reasons? Is this a secret prophecy about Muhammad? Doesn't look like it. Is it an embarrassing part of the story? No, it doesn't seem to be. It just switched when that decision was made. Completely. It's not a small switch, it's a huge switch in the story. And so we are left without any actual motive for why the corruption would occur. You know, and folks, it is important for you to push this with the Muslims to give us an actual answer. Because you will find out that the Muslims actually have no answers to this. They really don't. They don't have an answer as to why the Jews would corrupt their own scriptures in an intentional and significant way. There has to be a motive. Okay? When Chris at Speaker's Corner confronted Jake on this, he simply said that they were hypocrites. Like as if that's a motive in itself. It isn't. People can be hypocritical all the time. It doesn't mean that they want to destroy their own God-giving revelation in such a minor and completely insignificant way that doesn't seem to benefit them at all. What I'm trying to say is this, guys. If a story has to be changed, if the Jews have corrupted a story, they have to have a motive. They have to have the motive. Now, if they can't give you a motive or an intentional corruption, then becomes a fairy tale. It's a fairy tale explanation that they have stuck on, they've stapled on to anything. Whenever the Quran contradicts the previous scriptures, the Bible, they've just stuck this ad hoc, it's corruption. Now, I want you to understand what effort would have gone into for the Jews to corrupt the story. The question you have to ask them is, how could the Jews globally pull this off? How could they have globally pulled this off? Tell us how this could have done. It's probably worth pushing them to give an account as to how the corruption is actually possible. The Muslims would have to explain how the Jews collectively across all the Jewish diaspora all over the world decided to modify the story with a complete agreement across every synagogue in the world, without anyone knowing or writing that this had occurred across the entire Jewish diaspora. I want you to think, this is what the Muslims would have to explain to us. How did they all get together across all the synagogues and across all the lands, and they all decided they're going to do the corruption on this story, and they're all going to be in agreement, and nobody ever wrote about this? Nobody ever wrote about it. Now, the Torah is both written and it has rabbis and Jewish leaders who have memorized this particular story. So you have had to change not only in the books, but all in everybody's collective memory. Think about this. That story would have to change across everybody's collective memory. So it's worth asking Muslims, how is that even possible? Because again, they do not have any good answers. Okay? When Jake was asked this, when the corruption happened, he said it happened immediately because as soon as the oral tradition began to develop into a written tradition, corruption would creep in. So, ignoring the fact that that doesn't account for why they would do this, that's not an answer why they would do it. Remember, motive exposes irrationality. The mechanism exposes historical implausibility. Motive is needed. Now, with Jake's explanation that they started corrupting the Torah as soon as the Jews got it, they started putting it into their books. That means you have a double corruption whammy, a talking point introduced by Muslims. A absolute ridiculous, stupid talking point. Let me explain what that means. What does double corruption whammy talking point mean? That means they are saying not only corruption happened, but multiple corruptions happened, which also makes them say that their Jesus, their Isa, is not a real prophet. They just nuked their Isa. Let me explain how. Okay, we have another problem because other prophets, according to the Quran, were given the Torah. Most notably, it was Isa or Jesus, correct? Jesus is given the Torah, it says in the Quran, which would have contained the correct version of Joseph's story. It says Allah taught Jesus and gave him the Torah and the Injil. He taught him that. It says that. He taught him that. So you would imagine, now, before Jesus, the Jews, they corrupted the original Torah. Then Allah comes during Jesus and gives him the real Torah, because the Quran explicitly says that Jesus was sent confirming the Torah and that he was given the gospel. So it's not sufficient for Muslims to argue that the corruption happened only once. The corruption now needs to happen a multitude of times in order to stay corrupted, basically. Why? Because then after Jesus is given the true Torah, they say again it got corrupted. Because they say in the 7th century it's a corrupted Torah. They say again it got corrupted. That's the double whammy. This is the stupidity of their claims. The Torah is corrupted in the Jews. Allah gives Jesus the right Torah, and then again it gets corrupted. Okay? So basically, it's not sufficient for Muslims to argue that the corruption happened once. The corruption needed to happen a multitude of times in order to stay corrupted. And the end result is they throw Jesus under the bus. They throw Jesus under the bus. So Muslims are basically telling you that Jesus was a kind of failed prophet at this point. He wasn't able to preserve either his own revelation or the re-revealing of the Torah he was given. He couldn't preserve either, and neither could his disciples. His disciples, who they say are Muslims, by the way. And it leads to the final view that Jesus is a failed prophet under the Islamic perspective. Now, of course, the Muslims won't accept that, but they'll struggle to deal with it with this point. Once they use the conscious edits, folks, they basically committed themselves to a God who cannot preserve revelation and a Jesus who cannot safeguard what he brings. That's the opposite of what they want. Okay? So now, There are two scholarships out there, Joseph Whitsom, okay, and you have also who else is there out here? There's Whitsom, and who's got the Syriac milieu of the Quran, who said something really, really odd about this story, the Joseph story, and how they narrated it and what happened to him in the Quran. They said Joseph isn't a Quran restoring the original. It's actually a major strand of scholarship actually argues is deeply entangled with the Syriac Christian literary tradition, the homilies. They're saying the story that the Quran puts about the story about Joseph and other parts about the story about Joseph is actually found in a 5th century Syriac Christian literary tradition homilies. So Joseph Whitburn, he says, he starts off by saying, in this chapter I will examine the Joseph story and argue that the Quranic version is closely related to the Syriac tradition. That directly undercuts the one-on-one retelling of Moses' original claim. It points to late antiquity Syriac milieu shaping the narrative. That means they're copying and pasting it from another book. And Whitsom is not shy in saying this. He says, my argument is not that the Syriac tradition provides the entire background, but that it plays a major role in the formation of the Quranic version. That's exactly the kind of line we can quote in a debate because it's clean and unambiguous from these authors. There are 7 features shared with the Syriac and not in the Jewish text. So Whitsom is summarizing his cumulative case. He says, in sum, we have identified 7 features common to the Quran on this story and the Syriac sources which are not found in the Jewish text. So what is it? The Quran is, in other words, they're saying, is copying and pasting from a 5th century book. And that is devastating to the common Muslim move and say, it's just Jewish oral tradition. Whitsom is saying some key parallels are Syriac specific. He says 2 features in Quran chapter 12 suggest an affinity with the Syriac poems. Continuous narrative, repeated use of the dialogue. So this looks like an intentional retelling of a story and literary shaping, not an accidental scribal trick. This is done on purpose. The other author is Charbel Risk, who explicitly reports, and we've got both of his books and papers I have, who explicitly reports on Whitsom's finding, and he says also that the Quran's Joseph story is closely related to the Syriac tradition. This Syriac tradition, folks, was written in the 5th century. There was no prophet then. This is just a normal people sitting down writing some stuff to you. The evidence suggests, he says, that the Quran was aware of the Christian Syriac traditions concerning Joseph. The Syriac tradition played a major role in the formation of those verses. And without the Syriac tradition, we cannot truly understand what the Quran is doing here. Why the hell is it saying this story? Where the hell is it getting this from? So now that's basically what we call a stacked set of citations you can rattle off to the Muslims, okay? So Risk says that this is a concrete departures from the Genesis and why they matter. So Risk says that he frames Quran chapter 12 as having identifiable departures, different stories from the biblical narrative. There are 4 Quranic departures, 2 omissions and 2 additions to the Quran's version of the story of what happened to the same story in the Torah. Why this matters for our argument is because we said conscious edit says that the Quran corrects corrupted Genesis back to its original. But the scholarship is showing that the Quran is doing selective omission, addition, and that it gets this from late antiquity, interpretive, and liturgical context, i.e. other Syriac tradition, literature, homilies. So it's not actually restoring the original thing that Moses says, it's a copy or paste from another book. Then Risk continues to note that this a widely discussed etymological point. He says, many scholars have pointed out that the Arabic Quran comes from Syriac Qaryana, meaning liturgical reading. Even if we don't push the etymology too hard, it supports the bigger picture. Syriac Christian liturgical and homiletical environments are in the background, which is again clashes with Allah is simply restoring the original Mosaic stories. No, they're copying and pasting it from a 5th century. It cannot be God who's done this. Now, I have got some of the differences laid out here. Here you see this, okay? Joseph Whitson, from his book, some of the differences laid out here, okay? We have, remember, he does not argue vague influence. He argues that there is structural, literary, and thematic dependence on a 5th century homilies and literature, Syriac Christian literature that the Quran is copying from. He explicitly states the Quranic version is closely related to Syriac tradition. The Syriac tradition played a major role in the formation of the Quranic version in his book, chapter 7.1, under introduction. That is already fatal to this conscious edits thing that these Muslims have come up with. Conscious edits claims what? That Quran restores Moses' original Genesis. It claims it cannot reflect the late Christian retellings, because he's saying the late Christian retellings are corrupted. It cannot depend. It says the conscious edit will not depend on any 5th or 6th century homiletic literature. The Quran is just retelling the original story. It's not depending on anybody else's book written in the 5th, 6th century, 100, 200 years before Muhammad. There's no prophet out there. There's no revelation out there. Whitson says it cannot. Okay? Now, here's the plotting and location framing. In Genesis 37, the brothers conspire after seeing Joseph approaching. In Quran 12, again, the brothers' conspiracy dialogue is structured differently and framed in a way closer to Syriac narrative elaborations. Whitson shows that the Quran structuring of the conspiracy scene aligns with the Syriac poetic retellings rather than the Masoretic text. This is exactly the example that we have highlighted. If the Quran is restoring Moses' original story, why does it align with the Syriac liturgical retellings instead of Genesis? There are more things in there. These are the 7 ones that I have out there. All of these things that Quran 12 says, it's pulling from the Syriac book. So, having said that, now we can bring up the Muslims and start asking them any questions that they have. So we're going to go back to the original thing. We're going to have them first talk to us about this conscious edits and explain to us first how is their theory falsifiable? Remember that. Okay? Let's see. I'm going to start bringing up a couple of them. They've been waiting a long time. I don't know if they're still around. If they're not, then many of them just request and then walk away. So they were like 8 or 9 in the chat waiting for it. Okay, let me do something here real quick.